Victor Langley slammed the quarterly projections onto the conference table hard enough to make the coffee cups rattle. I don't care about the variance numbers, he said, cutting off the head of structural engineering mid-sentence. I care about the launch date, October 15th. That date does not move. Victor, the stress fracture readings on the delta frame are a rounding error. He pointed at the man with one finger. Fix the paperwork. Don't fix what isn't broken. No one in that room said another word. They just looked down at their tablets and pretended they hadn't heard what they'd just heard, because at Ether Dynamics, silence had always been the safest career move. If a story like this stays with you, a father who sacrificed everything in silence while the world rewrote his name, then you're exactly who this channel was made for. Hit the like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling us which city or country you're watching from. We genuinely want to know how far this story travels. The morning Nolan Carter drove his daughter to her first day of work, he wore the same canvas jacket he'd been wearing since she was in middle school. It was a faded olive green, the kind that had gone soft at the elbows from years of contact with engine housings and hydraulic lines. There was a small tear near the left breast pocket that Lena had offered to sew up at least a dozen times. He'd always said he'd get around to it. He never did. The truck was a 1994 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. Lena sat pressed against the passenger door with her blazer folded carefully across her lap, trying to keep it from picking up the faint smell of motor oil that had permanently embedded itself into the seat fabric. She'd bought the blazer 3 weeks ago. Navy blue, structured shoulders, the kind that said entry-level professional without screaming it. She'd tried it on in the store mirror for 20 minutes before deciding it was the one. You nervous? Her father asked. No, she said. He glanced at her. Maybe a little, she admitted. Nolan nodded. He drove the way he did everything. Without hurrying, without commentary, like each action was already decided before it started. He merged onto the interstate and settled into the right lane at exactly the speed limit while everyone else blew past him. Lena looked at her phone. The Ether Dynamics campus was another 14 minutes away according to the map, though she'd already driven the route twice in the past week just to be sure she knew where she was going. She'd made a note of the parking structure, the visitor entrance versus the employee entrance, the security desk location. She did not like surprises on important days. You eat breakfast? Her father asked. I had coffee. That's not breakfast. It had oat milk in it. That counts. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. When you were little, you used to eat scrambled eggs every single morning. Remember that? I remember you burning them approximately 40% of the time. I never burned them. Dad, there was a phase where the smoke detector went off so regularly that I thought it was part of the morning routine. That was the pan. Bad pan. You had that pan for 11 years. 11 good years, he said. She smiled at the window so he wouldn't see it. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction. The Ether Dynamics campus appeared gradually. First the perimeter fence, then the security checkpoint, then the main access road lined with Bradford pear trees that someone had planted in a row so precise it looked almost artificial. Beyond the tree line, the main building rose into the late September sky, a sweeping arc of glass and steel that caught the morning sun and threw it back in ribbons. Behind it, just visible through the gap between the administrative complex and the research hangar, the tail fin of an aircraft stood against the blue. Enormous, white, and still. Lena straightened in her seat. That's it, she said, almost to herself. Yep. She looked at her father. He was watching the road, expression unchanged. She'd expected some reaction, pride maybe, or at least acknowledgement that this was not an ordinary building, that getting a position here fresh out of a master's program was not an ordinary thing. She'd graduated second in her cohort in aeronautical systems compliance. She'd beaten out over 300 applicants for this role. She had tried not to make a big deal out of that, but she had also, privately, expected someone to make a small deal out of it. Nolan Carter did not make deals out of things. He followed the signage for employee parking and turned into the main lot. That was when the gap became impossible to ignore. The parking lot at Ether Dynamics was arranged in tiers, with the upper level nearest the main entrance reserved for executives and credentialed visitors. Even from a distance, Lena could see the kind of cars that filled those spaces. The matte finish SUVs, The German sedans with badges that gleamed, one or two vehicles with the kind of quiet, understated elegance that communicated wealth without trying to. The whole row looked like the parking lot of a financial summit. And then there was Nolan's truck easing into a general visitor spot on the lower tier, its left rear quarter panel carrying a rust spot the size of a dinner plate that he'd been promising to deal with since the Obama administration. Lena felt it, that small, involuntary clench of embarrassment she immediately resented feeling. She was 26 years old and she knew better. Her father was a good man and a gifted mechanic, and he had raised her alone for 18 years without complaint and without credit, and she was not going to feel embarrassed about his truck. She felt embarrassed about his truck. "I can walk from here," she said, more quickly than she meant to. Nolan had already put it in park. "I'll pull up closer." "No, really. The lot's a little tight." "It's not tight." She gathered her blazer in her bag. "I just don't want you to have to circle back. Traffic will be worse if you wait." He looked at her steadily. "You want me to stay in the lower lot?" It wasn't an accusation. That was somehow worse. "I just think—" "It's okay, Lena." 2 words. Flat, quiet, without injury. The worst possible response because it meant he'd understood exactly what she was thinking and had decided not to make her defend it. He did that sometimes. Extended a kind of grace she hadn't asked for and absolutely didn't deserve, and it sat in her chest like a stone. "Dad, go on. You don't want to be late." She got out of the truck. She stood on the pavement and bent to look back through the open window. He was already looking forward through the windshield, one hand loose on the wheel, the other resting on the doorframe. "Thank you for the ride," she said. "Any time." She started walking toward the main entrance. She was about 30 yards away when she heard the truck door open. She glanced back. Nolan had gotten out and was standing beside the vehicle, not because he'd forgotten something, but because she could see this even from a distance. Some instinct had brought him upright. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the building. She turned back around and kept walking. The lobby of Ether Dynamics was the architectural version of a firm handshake, impressive without being warm. The ceiling vaulted 2 full stories above a polished concrete floor, and along the far wall, a cross-section display of the company's current flagship project had been mounted in a way that was clearly meant to inspire awe. The aircraft was called the Etherlift X9. Lena had read every public document filed on it during her application process. She knew the wingspan, the projected fuel efficiency ratings, the target passenger capacity, the delivery timeline. She had studied it the way other people studied for bar exams. She approached the security desk and gave her name. The guard checked his list, found her, handed her a visitor badge, and pointed her toward the elevator bank. "HR is on 4. Someone will be down to meet you." "Thank you." She'd just attached the badge to her lapel when she heard it. A shift in the ambient noise of the lobby. Not a sound exactly, but an absence of sound. The low conversation near the elevator bank, the click of heels on concrete. All of it paused, like someone had pressed a collective pause button on the room. She turned. Celeste Ashford, the CEO of Ether Dynamics, was crossing the lobby at a pace that was just shy of running. Lena recognized her from press coverage, early 50s, silver-streaked hair worn pulled back, the kind of controlled posture that spoke of decades of executive performance. She'd seen Celeste give keynotes. She'd watched footage of her presenting the Etherlift program to congressional committees. In every clip, the woman moved like someone who had already calculated the outcome of every conversation in the room. She was not calculating anything right now. She was moving with an urgency that looked almost involuntary, threading through the lobby at pace, past the security desk, and straight toward the front doors. Every head in the lobby had turned. Lena's gaze followed the CEO's trajectory automatically, the way you track a car that's moving too fast in a parking lot. Her eyes landed on the glass front doors. On the other side of those doors, in the general visitor lot, standing beside a 1994 Ford F-150 with a rust spot on the rear quarter panel, was her father. He wasn't doing anything. I was just standing there the way he always stood, weight balanced, hands at his sides, watching the building with that same quiet attention he gave to everything. The same expression he wore when he was trying to understand how something worked before he decided whether it could be fixed. Celeste Ashford pushed through the front doors. She crossed the plaza. Her heels hit the pavement with the kind of rhythm that made people in nearby parking spaces look up from their phones. She covered the distance between the entrance and the lower lot in under 20 seconds, and when she reached Nolan Carter, she stopped. She didn't speak immediately. She just stood there, and for a moment something moved across her face. Something complicated. Something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to find the right form. Then she inclined her head. Not a nod, not a casual acknowledgement, a genuine inclination, deliberate and unhurried. "Sir," she said. One word, clear enough to carry. Nolan Carter looked at her. His expression didn't change. He said something back, low, and she replied, and then they were talking, quietly, standing 10 feet from his rusted truck, while behind the lobby glass 30 Ether Dynamics employees stood at various angles of frozen attention. Lena had not moved. She was still standing near the security desk, visitor badge on her lapel, blazer over her arm, watching her father and the CEO of the company she'd just started working for have a conversation she couldn't hear. "Do you know him?" She turned. A man in his mid-30s with a lanyard badge and an expression of barely contained curiosity was standing beside her. "That's my father," she said. He blinked. "Your father?" "Yes." He looked back toward the plaza. "That's Nolan Carter." "I know," she said. "He drove me here." The man opened his mouth, then closed it, then said, "Do you know who he is?" She turned to look at him more directly. "He's a mechanic. He runs a repair shop on Alderman Street." The man looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something that cannot possibly be what it sounds like. "I've worked here 6 years," he said slowly. "I've heard his name in this building more times than I can count. And nobody," he paused, choosing his words, "nobody out there called him sir because of a repair shop." She looked back through the glass. Her father was still talking to Celeste Ashford. His hands had come up now. One of his habits when he was explaining something technical, a quiet animation that broke through his usual stillness. Celeste was listening with the whole of her attention, not the practiced, performative attention of an executive managing a difficult stakeholder. Real listening. The kind where you go quiet all the way through. "What does that mean?" Lena asked. The man hesitated. "There's a name in this company. In the early records, the original engineering documentation. A name people talk about like a ghost story, or a cautionary tale depending on who's telling it." "What name?" He looked at her. "Carter," he said. She didn't say anything. "There was an engineer," he continued, quieter now, like he wasn't entirely sure he should be saying any of this. "Before the company went public, before Celeste Ashford took over. Some people say he basically built the theoretical backbone of what became the Etherlift program, the early aerodynamic models, the core safety integration system. He was supposed to be the chief engineer on the first major aircraft certification. But something happened, a scandal, people say, though nobody agrees on exactly what. His name was removed from the official records. He disappeared from the industry. The company rewrote the narrative, and by the time anyone thought to question it, he shrugged. Nobody knew where he'd gone." Lena was looking at her father. He had the same old jacket, the same worn boots. He was standing in a visitor parking space next to a truck that needed 3 different things fixed on it, talking to the CEO of a billion-dollar aerospace corporation, like it was a conversation he'd been postponing for a long time. "How long ago was this?" she asked. 19 years, maybe 20? I only know because I was an intern the year they finally sealed the original project files. Someone told me not to ask about them. I didn't. You learn fast around here which questions don't get answered." Outside, the conversation between her father and Celeste Ashford was ending. She could see it in their postures, the slight shift back, the way a discussion settles when it's reached a natural edge. Her father said something. Celeste nodded. Her hand came up briefly. Not a handshake, but something in that direction, an acknowledgement of some kind. And then she turned and walked back toward the building. Nolan watched her go. Then he turned and looked at the truck, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that Lena had never seen on him before. She didn't have a name for it. It was somewhere between grief and recognition, like encountering a version of yourself you thought you'd successfully left behind. Then he reached out, opened the truck door, and got in. The engine turned over. First try, always first try. He kept that engine in perfect condition, and the truck backed out of the space and joined the exit lane. Lena watched it go. Celeste Ashford came back through the lobby doors. Her face had returned to its usual calibration. composed, purposeful, already 3 steps ahead of wherever she was standing. But she looked, just briefly, at the security desk where Lena was standing. Something passed between them that wasn't recognition. Celeste didn't know who she was yet, but it was attention. The CEO's eyes registered her visitor badge, her presence, her stillness. Then she walked past, back toward whatever board meeting or briefing she'd left, and the lobby resumed its ambient rhythm like a breath released. The man with the lanyard badge had already drifted away. Lena stood alone in the middle of the lobby, her blazer still folded over her arm, her visitor badge clipped neatly to her lapel. Her first day at Ether Dynamics officially begun. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She'd given her information to HR during the intake process. Orientation starts at 9 o'clock in conference room 4B. Someone will meet you at the elevator. She looked at the text. She looked at the front doors, which had stilled again. She looked at the enormous cross-section of the Etherlift X9 mounted on the far wall. The clean white curves, the engineered perfection of its lines, the small placard below it that read, Innovation, Integrity, the Future of Flight. She thought about a name removed from official records. She thought about files someone had been told not to ask about. She thought about 20 years of her father coming home from the shop with grease on his hands and nothing, absolutely nothing, about his past in the aerospace industry, about whatever had happened to him before she was old enough to ask, or after she was old enough to stop accepting non-answers. She thought about the way he'd looked at the building when he got out of the truck, like he recognized it, like it recognized him back. She thought about one word spoken by a CEO who had walked out of a board meeting to stand in a visitor parking lot. Sir. The elevator doors opened. A woman with a clipboard and a warm professional smile appeared. Lena Carter? That's me, Lena said. She walked toward the elevator. She did not think about the orientation packet in her bag, or the professional goals she'd written down at the HR department's request, or what kind of first impression she wanted to make on her team lead. She thought about her father's hands on the wheel of that old truck, the way he'd driven 14 miles on the interstate without once exceeding the speed limit, and the way he'd said, it's okay. Lena-like forgiveness was something he kept in an unlimited supply. She stepped into the elevator. She pressed 4. The doors closed, and the building held her. And somewhere below her in the sealed archive rooms she didn't yet know existed, the answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask were waiting in folders that hadn't been opened in 19 years. The orientation packet had 12 pages, and Lena read none of them. She sat in conference room 4B with 3 other new hires. A materials analyst named Derek, who kept adjusting his badge lanyard. A procurement specialist named Joanna, who was taking notes on everything, including the part where HR explained where the bathrooms were. And a quiet man in his 40s named Phil, who had apparently transferred from the Denver office and seemed deeply unimpressed by all of it. The HR coordinator, a pleasant woman named Sandra, who had clearly given this exact presentation many times and had found a way to make her voice sound enthusiastic about it. Without actually being enthusiastic, walked them through the employee handbook, the benefits portal, the security clearance tiers, and the company's stated commitment to a culture of innovation and transparency. Lena looked at the word transparency on the slide and thought about sealed archive rooms. After orientation ended, Sandra walked them to their respective departments. Lena was assigned to the Compliance and Systems Review team on the 7th floor, which occupied a cluster of open-plan desks arranged around a central glass-walled conference room. Her team lead was a compact, precise woman named Rita Ochoa, mid-40s, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the practiced manner of someone who had spent years translating between engineers and regulators without fully belonging to either world. Carter, Rita said, shaking her hand once firmly, I've looked at your thesis work. The fatigue modeling on composite airframe sections was solid. Don't let it go to your head. That's just a starting point here. Understood, Lena said. You'll spend the first 2 weeks on document review. Nothing glamorous. Etherlift X9 certification filings go back 4 years, and there are gaps in the submission record that need to be tracked and annotated before we can proceed with the next regulatory review. Think of it as archaeology, except the artifacts are mostly PDFs and the stakes are higher. She was assigned a desk, a login, and a stack of physical binders that someone had apparently decided needed to coexist alongside the digital filing system. The binders were color-coded. The system for the color coding was not immediately obvious. She spent the first hour decoding it. She found the first gap in the certification record by early afternoon. It wasn't dramatic. It was a missing cross-reference notation in a structural load test submission from 22 months ago, the kind of thing that should have been caught by the filing team at the time, but hadn't been. She flagged it in the system the way Rita had shown her, added a note, moved on. But the gap pointed toward an earlier document, and that earlier document pointed toward a baseline specification that didn't match the numbers in the current certification package. She flagged that too. She stayed 40 minutes past the official end of her first day working backward through the filing chain. When she finally logged off, the floor had mostly emptied. Rita was still at her desk in the corner, reading something on paper with her glasses down where they were supposed to be. She looked up when Lena put her coat on. "You find something?" Rita asked. It wasn't phrased as a question exactly, more as a confirmation of something she'd been waiting to hear. Baseline discrepancy in the frame load specifications between the 2021 filing and the current package. Rita took her glasses off slowly. "Which section?" "Delta frame assembly. The lateral stress tolerance numbers don't match. The current package is using a figure that's about 12% lower than what the original test data supports, which would be fine if there was an amendment explaining why, but I can't find one." Rita was quiet for a moment. "Document it. Don't circulate it yet. Bring it to me tomorrow morning before you file anything through the official channel." "Is that standard procedure?" "It is now," Rita said, and put her glasses back on. Lena thought about that on the drive home. She'd taken the bus, which had taken 40 minutes longer than it should have because of a signal delay downtown, and she'd stood in the aisle the whole way holding an overhead rail and thinking about Delta frame specifications and her father's hands on a steering wheel. She called him from the bus stop. "How was it?" he asked. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been near his phone, which was unusual for him during shop hours. "Good," she said. "Fine. It was a first day. Make any enemies yet?" "It's been 8 hours, Dad. I made 3 enemies my first week at Consolidated Aerospace. By the end of the month, they respected me. Enemies turn into something useful faster than friends do, in most workplaces." She almost let it go. She'd been letting things go her whole life when it came to him. The small references that surfaced sometimes. The moments when his vocabulary shifted and he sounded less like a mechanic explaining a carburetor and more like someone who'd once inhabited a completely different life. She'd always told herself she was being respectful. She was starting to think she'd been being incurious. "Consolidated Aerospace," she said. A pause. "Not long, but present. That was a long time ago." "Before the shop?" "Before a lot of things." She gripped the phone a little tighter. "Celeste Ashford came out of the building today. To the parking lot. She spoke to you." Silence. "Dad." "I saw her." "She called you sir." Another silence, this one longer, with a different texture to it. Not evasion exactly, but something more careful, like he was measuring the distance between what she was asking and what he was ready to say. "We've met before," he said. "It was a long time ago. It doesn't have anything to do with your job." "That's not an answer." "Lena, the man next to me in the lobby said your name like it was a ghost story." She heard him exhale. Not a sigh. More the sound a person makes when they've been holding something and decide, just for a moment, to put it down. "Get home safe," he said. "There's leftover soup in the fridge, the good kind, not the canned." "Dad." "Get some sleep. First days are long." He hung up. She stood at the bus stop in the cooling September air and looked at the screen of her phone for a long moment, then put it in her pocket and walked to her car. She did not sleep well. Then she said, "Don't go through Victor Langley." "Why not?" Rita picked up a pen and set it back down. It was the kind of gesture people make when they're deciding how much to say. "He's the one who reclassified those files in the first place, about 8 years ago. Moved them from standard archive to restricted without a lot of explanation. The official reason was proprietary technology protection, but..." She stopped. "But what?" "But nobody in engineering had asked for that restriction. It came from his office. And around the same time, there were 3 people on the original design team who left the company within about 6 months of each other, voluntarily, officially. But it was fast, and it was quiet, and it happened right after Victor took over as VP. Lena thought about what the man in the lobby had told her on her first day. A name people talk about like a ghost story. "Rita," she said, Does the name Nolan Carter mean anything to you? Something shifted in Rita's expression. Not surprise. It was more like a door that had been standing slightly open, finally swung wide enough to show what was behind it. Where did you hear that name? I told you my last name is Carter. I know your last name. He's my father. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind where a room recalibrates. Rita Ochoa, who Lena was quickly learning was not a woman who showed her reactions easily, took her glasses off and set them on her desk, and did not put them back on for a full 20 seconds. Your father, she said finally, is Nolan Carter. He runs a repair shop on Alderman Street. He drove me here on my first day in a truck that should have been retired 6 years ago. Rita looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at Lena. He drove you here, she repeated, like the fact required restating. In the visitor lot, Celeste Ashford walked out of the building to speak to him. Rita sat back in her chair. Okay, she said, in the tone of someone who has just understood the shape of a problem they've been trying to solve for a long time. Okay, here's what I can tell you, and I want to be clear that most of this is reconstruction from partial information, because the official record has been managed deliberately. Lena waited. When the Etherlift program was in its original design phase, this was before the company went public, before Celeste took over, before Victor Langley was anything more than a mid-level project manager. There was a chief engineer who built the core of what eventually became the X9. Not the current version. The original design philosophy. The aerodynamic modeling. The safety integration architecture. The load distribution framework that the whole certification approach was built around. She paused. His name was on every foundational document. He was one of those engineers who doesn't come around often. The kind who can see the whole system at once, not just the part they're responsible for. Nolan Carter, Lena said. The company was positioning for a very large government contract. There was pressure from the board to accelerate the certification timeline. Your father, from what I've pieced together, refused to sign off on a modification to the Delta frame assembly that the program director at the time was pushing for. A structural shortcut. It would have cut development costs significantly and shaved months off the schedule. She paused again. He said it wasn't safe. He put it in writing. Lena felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. What happened? She asked, though some part of her had already started assembling the answer. He was removed from the program. The official story was a conduct issue, some vague allegation about misuse of proprietary data. It was never substantiated, but it didn't need to be. They stripped his authorization, sealed his project files, and he was out. The program director retired early 2 years later. Victor Langley moved up. The company restructured. Celeste took over as CEO about 5 years after your father left, and the Etherlift program got rebuilt using a modified version of your father's original framework, with his name nowhere on it. Lena was quiet for a long time. And the Delta frame issue he refused to sign off on, she said finally. Rita looked at her steadily. That's what you found in the certification filings. The 12% discrepancy. The numbers in the current package reflect a tolerance modification that was applied during the 2020 redesign phase. There's a change order buried in the supplemental filings, barely a paragraph. It's technically documented, which is why it survived certification review, but it traces back to the same structural modification your father refused to approve 20 years ago. It just went around him. Lena thought about the Etherlift X9, its tail fin visible through the gap between buildings, white and enormous against the morning sky. The launch was scheduled for October 15th. She'd read the press materials during orientation. 40 journalists, 3 federal regulators, a live broadcast. How many people are supposed to be on the aircraft for the demonstration flight, she asked. 72, Rita said. Crew, selected press, company representatives, and 2 members of the Federal Aviation Oversight Committee. The number sat between them like an object neither of them wanted to pick up. I need to see those restricted files, Lena said. I know, Rita said, and I can't get them for you through official channels without triggering a review flag that goes directly to Victor Langley's office. Then how? Rita picked up her pen again. This time she actually wrote something, a name, a room number, and a time, on a piece of paper, which she slid across the desk. There's a senior engineer who's been with the company for 23 years. He was on the original design team. He didn't leave when the others did, and I've never been entirely sure if that was because he had less to lose or more courage. She tapped the paper. His name is Owen Marsh. He works late. He has a memory like an index database and a filing cabinet in his office that he's never connected to the main system. She met Lena's eyes. He also knew your father, personally. Owen Marsh's office was at the end of a corridor on the third floor that felt slightly outside of the building's main circulatory system. The kind of hallway that existed because the architecture had needed it to, but nobody had bothered to make it feel intentional. The overhead light at the far end was slightly dimmer than it should have been, not broken exactly, just tired. The door was plain, without the nameplate display units that the other senior engineers had, and the only indication that anyone occupied it was the thin line of light visible beneath the door. She knocked. "It's open," said a voice that sounded like it had been used heavily and maintained poorly. Owen Marsh was 61, heavy-set in the way of someone who had once been physically active and had gradually redirected that energy inward. He had a white beard that needed trimming and bifocals with a small chip in the left lens that he appeared to have decided not to deal with. His desk was extraordinary, not in the impressive sense but in the archaeological sense, covered with paper and strata that suggested years of accumulation under a system only he understood. Behind him, an actual physical filing cabinet with actual physical drawers stood against the wall. 4 drawers, all labeled in handwriting. He looked at her when she came in and did not look surprised. "Rita called," he said. "Sit down." There was one chair that wasn't covered in paper. She sat in it. "You're Nolan's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He studied her for a moment in the evaluating way of someone deciding how much credit to give an assumption. "You've got his way of sitting," he said finally, "like you're ready to stand back up." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't. "What do you know?" he asked. "The Delta frame modification, the restricted files, the original design team." She paused. "My father." "Which parts of your father?" "The parts he never told me about." Owen leaned back in his chair, which protested under the shift. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they're deciding where to start a long story. "Your father was the best structural systems engineer I've ever worked with," he said. "And I've worked with a lot of people over a lot of years, so that's not a small statement. He had, I don't know how to describe it to someone who isn't an engineer. Some people understand systems piece by piece. Your father understood them the way you understand a sentence, as a whole thing, where every part affects every other part." He paused. He also had the specific misfortune of being right at a time when being right was very expensive for the people above him. "Tell me about the frame modification," Lena said. The program director at the time was a man named Harold Greer. Harold was smart, well-connected, and under enormous pressure from the board to deliver the X9 prototype within a budget that had already been cut twice. The Delta frame assembly, the lateral load-bearing structure for the mid-fuselage, had a design specification that your father had built from scratch. His numbers called for a specific grade of composite layering at the primary stress points. Harold wanted to use a lighter, cheaper alternative that had been certified for a different class of aircraft. Owen's voice was even, recounting this the way you recount something you've revisited many times. The substitution would save about $4 million and cut 8 weeks off the fabrication schedule. Your father ran the stress models. He ran them 3 times. The number said that under extended high-altitude operations, the alternative composite would show fatigue degradation at about 60 to 65% of what the original specification could handle. Not catastrophic on the first flight, not on the 10th, but at scale over time under the kind of operational stress a commercial aircraft accumulates. It was a failure waiting for the right conditions. "He refused to sign off on it," Lena said. "He didn't just refuse, he documented it. Full technical analysis, filed through every proper channel he could find, including a direct written report to the board liaison. Harold Greer told him the concerns were noted and would be reviewed. 2 weeks later, your father got a notice that his security access had been suspended, pending an investigation into alleged misuse of proprietary engineering data." Lena felt the anger come up before she could manage it. "That's fabricated." Of course it was fabricated. There was no investigation. There were allegations, anonymous, undocumented, that he'd been sharing design schematics with a competitor. Nobody who actually knew him believed it for a minute. But it didn't matter what anyone believed. It was enough to remove him from the program, and once he was out, Harold Greer owned the narrative. Owen leaned forward. The modification went through. The lighter composite was approved using a certification pathway that technically met the letter of the standard. Harold had people who were very good at finding the letter and forgetting the spirit. The original stress analysis your father had filed was reclassified as a superseded internal document, and Nolan Carter left the industry. And went to fix cars, Lena said. It came out flatter than she intended. And raised his daughter alone, Owen said, with a quiet precision that made her feel the correction without it being made harshly. She looked at her hands for a moment. The modification is still in the current aircraft. The core of it, yes. There were improvements in the 2020 redesign, better fabrication processes, some additional reinforcement at the primary joints. But the fundamental material choice traces back to Harold Greer's cost reduction. And if your baseline discrepancy analysis is correct, and knowing Nolan Carter's daughter found it, I believe it is, then the current certification package is carrying a structural tolerance number that has never been validated against real operational data. October 15th, she said. Owen's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Victor has been pushing that date for 2 years. There's a defense contract renewal tied to it. If the demonstration flight happens on schedule and goes cleanly, the contract gets extended for 7 years, and the value of it is... He made a gesture with his hand that implied a number too large to bother stating. If it doesn't happen, the government partner has the right to open the program to competing bids. And Victor knows about the frame issue? Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, Victor Langley has known about the original stress analysis your father filed since before he became VP of Engineering. He was Harold Greer's project coordinator at the time. He was in the room when the decision was made. The words settled with a weight that seemed disproportionate to how quietly Owen had said them. "There's more," he said. He got up from his desk with some effort and went to the filing cabinet behind him. Second drawer from the bottom. He opened it, flipped through several folders with the practiced ease of someone who'd been navigating that particular system for 2 decades, and pulled out a manila folder that was thicker than the others. He set it on the desk in front of her. She opened it. Inside were photocopies. Older documents, some of them clearly reproduced from originals that had been handled a lot, the edges worn, the typeface. In some places, the older kind from before everything went fully digital. There were technical drawings she couldn't entirely read without reference materials, but the notation system was consistent with aerospace engineering schematics. There were memos. There was a formal letter on company letterhead dated 19 years ago, addressed to the board of directors. At the bottom of the letter was a signature. Nolan A. Carter, Chief Engineer, Etherlift Development Program. She read the letter. It was 4 pages long, methodical, and in a voice she recognized. Not the voice of her father explaining a carburetor, but the precision and the structure was the same quality of someone who had already thought through every objection before they raised the concern. He'd laid out the technical analysis in terms a non-engineer could follow, translated the stress modeling into plain risk language, and ended with a single paragraph that was the closest thing to an ultimatum she'd ever seen her father write. "I cannot in good conscience authorize the certification of this aircraft modification under the current proposed standard. The risk to aircraft occupants at operational scale is not theoretical. I am formally requesting that this matter be reviewed by independent structural assessment before any further progress on the certification timeline. I am prepared to make this request public through appropriate regulatory channels if internal review is denied." "He threatened to go to the regulators," she said. "He did. And 2 days after that letter was delivered, the conduct allegations appeared." Owen sat back down. He never got to make the regulatory report. By the time he understood what was happening to him, he'd been removed from the program and the window had closed. Harold Greer retired. Victor moved up. And the letter went into a folder in my filing cabinet because I was the only person on that team who kept a copy of everything. Lena looked at the letter for a long moment. Her father's signature at the bottom, his actual handwriting, which she recognized from grocery lists and birthday cards, and the note he'd left on the fridge when she was 16 and he'd had to work a late job. "Soup and pot, don't touch the thermostat." The same handwriting, 19 years earlier, on a document that had nearly cost him everything and had in some ways cost him more than that. "Why didn't you ever come forward with this?" she asked. Owen was quiet for a moment. It was the honest kind of quiet, not the defensive kind. I have a pension. I have a daughter in medical school. I have a wife who had cancer 3 years ago and is doing well now. But the insurance through this company, he stopped. I'm not proud of that answer, but it's the true one. She didn't say anything. She wasn't in a position to judge him. Your father knew, Owen said. He knew I had the copies. He told me to keep them and not do anything with them until there was something worth doing. He looked at her. He always said that evidence without the right moment is just paper. She looked down at the letter again. The date. The signature. The 4 careful pages of a man trying to stop something that happened anyway. Then she closed the folder. Can I take this? She asked. That's why I kept it, Owen said. She stood up. She put the folder under her arm. Her blazer, still navy, still structured, though it felt like she'd bought it a long time ago, was hanging on the chair. She picked it up. One more thing, Owen said. Rita didn't tell you this, and I shouldn't either, but Victor Langley knows the baseline discrepancy exists. His office had a flag on the certification filing system. The minute someone in compliance started pulling threads on the Delta frame numbers, he was notified. She stopped. He knows someone's looking, Owen said. He just doesn't know who. She looked at him. He will soon, she said. Owen nodded. Then I'd move quickly. She walked out of his office, down the quiet corridor with the tired light, and stood for a moment in the stairwell before she went back to the main floor. The folder was under her arm. The building hummed around her with its usual ambient noise, the HVAC, the distant sound of someone printing something, the particular silence of an organization that had learned to keep its mouth shut. Somewhere on this campus, an aircraft was sitting in a hangar with 72 seats and a demonstration flight scheduled for October 15th. And somewhere on Alderman Street, her father was closing up his shop for the evening, wiping his hands on a rag, saying nothing about any of this to anyone, because that was what he did. He carried things quietly until the weight of them changed him in ways he never mentioned and never explained. She had spent her whole life accepting that as just the way he was. She was done accepting it. Part 3. Truth Against Power. She called him that night from her car in the Ether Dynamics parking structure, engine off, the folder on the passenger seat where her blazer had been that first morning. He answered on the 3rd ring. I need you to come in, she said. A pause. To the building. Yes. Lena, Dad. She stopped herself, took a breath, started again. I have Owen Marsh's folder. I have the letter you wrote to the board. I have the original stress analysis. And I have a certification filing for a demonstration flight in 12 days that is carrying a structural tolerance number that does not match the validated test data. The silence on his end was different from the silences she'd gotten before. Those had been careful, managed, the silences of a man choosing what to withhold. This one was different. This one sounded like a door she'd been knocking on for 20 years had finally come off its hinges. Owen kept copies, he said. Not a question. He kept everything. Another silence. Then, how bad is the discrepancy? 12% on the lateral stress tolerance. The current certification package is using a number that's 12% below what your original test data supports, with no amendment documentation that satisfies a full independent review. She heard him exhale slowly. What's the flight profile for the demonstration? Extended high-altitude cruise, 40-minute segment at operating ceiling before descent. Load? 72 occupants, full fuel. He was quiet for long enough that she checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. That's the condition, he said finally. That's exactly the operational profile I modeled. Extended high altitude under full load. That's where the fatigue differential in the composite shows up. Not immediately. But the stress accumulation in that flight profile is... He stopped. 12 days. October 15th. I heard about the launch date. He said it in a way that made her understand he'd been following the program from a distance for a long time. Reading the trade publications, tracking the press releases, watching the thing he'd built from the outside while other people put their names on it. Victor's been accelerating it. There's a defense contract renewal tied to it, 7 years, according to Owen. Victor needs that flight to happen on schedule. He would. His voice had gone quiet in the specific way it did when he was working through a problem, not shut down, but interior. She'd grown up watching that face across the dinner table and not understanding what it meant. Now she did. What does Celeste know? I don't know yet. She met with Rita last week. A closed-door session I wasn't part of. Rita hasn't said what came out of it. Celeste knows more than she shows, he said. She always did. The question is what she's been willing to do about it. She came out to the parking lot to meet you, Lena said. On my first day. She walked out of a board meeting. I know. Why? He was quiet. Dad, why did she come out to meet you? Because I'd sent her a message the week before, when I found out you'd been hired. I told her I knew about the program, that I'd been watching the certification timeline, and that I was concerned. A pause. I didn't want to walk into that situation without at least making contact first. Lena pressed her back into the seat. You knew, before I even started. I suspected. There's a difference. You drove me to my first day at a company where you had an active safety concern about the flagship aircraft, and you said nothing. I drove you to your first day at a company where you'd earned a position through your own work, and I didn't want to put that in your lap before you'd even walked in the door. That wasn't your call to make. The silence that followed was a real one. Not evasion, not management. She'd actually landed somewhere that required him to sit with what she'd said. No, he said finally. It wasn't. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her in years, maybe ever. It didn't fix anything, but it was real, and she could work with real. Will you come in? She asked again. Set the meeting, he said. With Celeste. Not Victor, not the board. Celeste, directly. I'll try. Don't try. Do it. Tell her Nolan Carter is willing to sit down and that he's bringing documentation. He hung up. She sat in the dark parking structure for another minute, then picked up the folder, got out of the car, and went back upstairs to find Rita. Rita Ochoa arranged the meeting in the way that competent people arrange difficult things, without drama, without leaving a trail, and without asking questions she didn't need answered. She sent a message through a personal channel to Celeste's assistant and framed it as a compliance briefing requiring CEO-level attention before the next regulatory filing. The meeting was set for the following evening, after business hours, in a conference room on the executive floor that wasn't on the main booking system. Lena spent the intervening 24 hours doing two things simultaneously. The first was building the technical documentation package, taking Owen's folder, cross-referencing it against the certification filings she'd been annotating, and constructing a chronological record that moved from the original 2004 stress analysis through the 2006 modification approval through the relaunch filings to the current certification package. It was painstaking work, and she made herself do it slowly, because the worst thing that could happen was a gap in the chain that Victor's people could leverage. The second thing she was doing, without quite admitting it to herself, was trying to decide how angry she was at her father and whether the anger was fair. She kept returning to the same collision of facts. He had known, or strongly suspected, that there was a problem. He had made contact with Celeste. He had driven her to her first day and said nothing. He had let her spend 2 weeks pulling at the threads of the certification record without telling her she was already standing on top of the thing he'd spent 20 years carrying. And underneath all of that, he had been right the first time. He had been right 19 years ago, and it had cost him his career, and she was starting to understand something else she didn't have a clean word for. Not bitterness, exactly. More like the specific damage that happens to a person who tells the truth clearly and is systematically dismantled for it. She understood something now that she hadn't before. The way he drove at exactly the speed limit, the way he never argued, never pushed, never demanded, the way he'd said, "It's okay, Lena," when she'd made him stay in the lower lot. That wasn't just his personality. That was what happened to a person when the system they'd trusted to work correctly had been used as a weapon against them. You got quiet. You got careful. You got very good at absorbing things without showing the cost. She brought the finished documentation package home at 11:30 and sat at the kitchen table and looked at it and thought about a man who had raised her alone for 18 years and had never once asked her to be grateful, and she felt something move in her chest that she didn't cry about, only because she was too tired. Nolan Carter arrived at the Ether Dynamics executive floor at 6:15 the following evening in the same canvas jacket. Lena had considered saying something about it. She had decided not to. If Celeste Ashford had walked through a parking lot to call him sir, in that jacket, then the jacket was fine. He looked different inside the building than he did anywhere else. Not uncomfortable. He wasn't the kind of man who got visibly uncomfortable, But there was a quality to the way he moved through the lobby and the elevator that suggested he was navigating from memory. He glanced at things in the way you glance at a place you used to know well and are trying to reconcile with what it's become. The lobby had been renovated twice since he'd worked here. Most of it was unrecognizable. But some things, the angle of the elevator bank, the position of the security desk, a particular junction in the corridor on the third floor that they passed on the way up, those he recognized. She could see it in the slight pause of his attention. He didn't say anything about any of it. Celeste Ashford was already in the conference room when they arrived. Rita was there too, seated to Celeste's left with a legal pad in front of her. The CEO looked, if anything, steadier than she had in the parking lot. She'd had time to prepare, and Celeste Ashford prepared thoroughly for everything. But when Nolan walked in, something in her posture shifted in the way of a person suppressing a response they didn't want to have in front of an audience. "Nolan," she said. "Celeste." He sat down across from her without ceremony. Lena sat beside him. She put the documentation package on the table. Celeste looked at it, then at Lena, then back at Nolan. "Your daughter found the discrepancy." "She did. I should tell you that when Rita first flagged this to me, I had our internal technical team run an independent check." Celeste's voice was even. "They confirmed the baseline inconsistency. The number in the current certification package cannot be validated against the original structural test data." "I know," Nolan said. "I built the original structural test data." Celeste looked at him for a moment. "I know you did." "Then we don't need to spend time establishing the problem. We need to talk about what happens next." "Victor will fight any delay on the demonstration flight," Celeste said. "I want you to understand the full picture before we discuss options. The defense contract renewal is not optional from the board's perspective. If we miss the October 15th date, the government partner has 60 days to open the program to competing bids. Given our current share price and the state of the capital markets, losing that contract would—" She stopped. "It would be very serious." 72 people, Nolan said. "I understand that." "I don't think you do. Not completely." He leaned forward slightly. This was the animation Lena had watched from across the lobby on her first morning. The hands, the precision, the quality of his attention when he was explaining something he understood at a cellular level. "The flight profile for the demonstration is exactly the operational condition I modeled in 2004 when I refused to approve the composite substitution. Extended high-altitude cruise under full load. The fatigue differential in the alternative composite doesn't express itself immediately. It accumulates. On that flight profile, you're looking at stress concentrations at the primary joint of the delta frame that will exceed what the material can handle, not on the first cycle. But the aircraft doesn't need to fail on its first flight to be unsafe. What you're risking is a microfracture initiation event during the demonstration flight that may not be visible or detectable in the immediate post-flight inspection. And then that aircraft goes into the certification pipeline with a compromised frame and at some point in its operational life. "I understand the mechanism," Celeste said. "Then cancel the flight." The room was quiet for a moment. "It's not that simple," Celeste said. "It's exactly that simple. The rest of it, the contract, the share price, the board, those are serious problems and I don't minimize them. But they're recoverable. A structural failure is not." He sat back. "I've been watching this program from a distance for a long time. I know what it cost the company to get here. I know what canceling the demonstration will cost. And I'm telling you that the alternative is worse." Celeste looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not resistance exactly, but the look of someone who had already reached the same conclusion and was still trying to find a different path out of the same room. "Victor will challenge the technical basis," she said. "He has his own engineers who will argue the current certification package is within acceptable parameters." "Then let's talk about what acceptable parameters actually means," Lena said. Both of them looked at her. She'd been quiet since they'd sat down, which was not her natural state but which had felt right. This was, in part, her father's conversation to have. But she'd spent 40 hours building the documentation package on the table in front of her, and she knew it better than anyone in the room. "The current certification filing uses a stress tolerance figure of 4.72 gigapascals for the delta frame primary joint," she said. "Victor's engineers will argue that figure meets the applicable regulatory standard, which requires a minimum of 4.5. And they're correct. It meets the minimum. What they won't mention is that the original validated test data for the actual composite material used in the current aircraft, not the theoretical specification, the actual material tested in the actual fabrication configuration, returns a fatigue threshold of 4.18 under the demonstration flight profile. She opened the documentation package to the tab she'd marked. That's the number my father's original analysis produced, and it's the number that a legitimate independent structural assessment would confirm. The certification filing is using a figure that has never been validated against the real material behavior. It's using a number that someone decided was close enough. The room was quiet again. Celeste looked at the document. She looked at it for a long time. If I take this to the board without a technical counter-argument from our own engineering team, she said slowly, Victor will frame it as a compliance department acting outside its authority on the basis of recovered documents from a discredited former employee. Nolan's jaw tightened slightly. Lena saw it and understood it was the closest he was going to come, in that room, to showing what that phrase cost him. He'll use the old conduct allegation, Nolan said, even though it was never substantiated. Yes, then we need something he can't discredit, Lena said. She looked at her father. The patent. Nolan was quiet. Owen told me, she said. The core safety integration architecture. The load distribution framework that the entire X9 certification is built around. You filed the original patent in 2003. Your name is on it. The company's current design uses a direct derivative of that framework, and your name has been systematically removed from every document that references it. Celeste looked at Nolan. Is that true? The patent filing is on record with the federal office, he said. They can't erase that. What they did was remove my name from the internal documentation and reclassify my contribution as a general company development. Legally, it's a gray area because of the employment contract terms at the time, but the patent record is public. That changes the character of the conduct allegation, Rita said from her end of the table. It was the first time she'd spoken. If Nolan Carter is the documented originator of the core architecture, then removing him from the program and discrediting him looks less like an internal performance issue and more like a deliberate effort to suppress a safety objection and eliminate the person who raised it. That's exactly what it was, Nolan said flatly. Celeste sat with that for a moment. Something moved across her face that was more personal than executive. The look of someone recalibrating their understanding of a history they'd thought they knew. I inherited this problem, she said. I want to be clear about that. When I took over this company, I was told the original certification dispute had been reviewed and resolved. I was told the technical concerns had been evaluated and addressed in the redesign. I was not told. She stopped. I was not given the full picture. I know, Nolan said. His voice had lost its edge. He wasn't letting her off the hook exactly, but he wasn't twisting it either. That's why I sent the message before Lena started. I wasn't asking for an apology. I was giving you a chance to get in front of it. And now we're in front of it, Celeste said. And now Victor Langley knows someone's been pulling threads, Lena said. Owen told me the filing system flags compliance activity on the Delta frame records to Victor's office. That flag triggered when I started the document review. He doesn't know who yet, but he will. As if the building itself had been listening, Celeste's phone, face up on the table, lit up with a name. All four of them looked at it. Victor Langley. Celeste reached over and declined the call without breaking eye contact with Nolan. He's going to accelerate, she said. If he suspects a challenge is forming, he'll try to move the launch date earlier, not later. Lock in the flight before anyone can organize a formal review. Can he do that unilaterally? Lena asked. He's the VP of Engineering. He controls the operational schedule. I can override him, but not without a board vote on a decision of that magnitude, and calling a board vote tips our hand. Then we need the independent structural assessment before he makes his move, Nolan said. A credentialed third-party engineering firm, physical inspection of the Delta frame, materials testing against the original specification. That result, combined with the patent record and the documentation package, is something the board can't ignore. And it's something Victor can't discredit by pointing at my employment history. How long for an independent assessment? Celeste asked Rita. For a full structural review at this level, 3 to 4 weeks minimum. We have 12 days, Lena said. An expedited review is possible, Rita said. If we contract a firm that has the right equipment on site, and we give them direct access to the aircraft. It'll cost significantly more, and the findings will need to be peer-reviewed, but the timeline is achievable. Victor will block direct access to the aircraft, Celeste said. Not if you authorize it, Nolan said. Another silence, the kind that meant something was being decided. If I authorize an expedited independent structural review, Celeste said carefully, Victor will know immediately what's happening. He'll go to the board directly. He'll argue I'm sabotaging the program on the basis of a grievance from a disgruntled former employee. Let him, Nolan said. Every argument he makes in that framing leads him toward the same wall. The patent record. The original stress analysis. The conduct allegation that was never substantiated. The more he argues that I'm not credible, the more the documentation contradicts him. Celeste looked at him. You've been planning this. I've been waiting for the right moment, he said. You told me once that the difference between a good engineer and a great one is knowing which problems to solve in sequence and which ones to solve in parallel. He paused. I remembered. Something shifted in Celeste's face, genuine, unguarded, the kind of thing that doesn't make it through an executive's usual filters. You did say that, she said quietly. I didn't know you'd kept it. I kept a lot of things. The room held that for a moment. Then Lena said, There's one more piece. She turned to another tab in the documentation package. Owen Marsh had something else in his folder besides the technical records. A personnel file, partial, reconstructed from copies he made at the time. It includes a memo from Harold Greer's office, dated 2 weeks after my father filed his letter to the board. The memo is addressed to the company's legal department and the HR director. It instructs them to open a conduct investigation into Nolan Carter and to document the allegation of proprietary data misuse. She smoothed the page on the table. The memo was written before any allegation had been reported. The investigation was created first. The allegation was documented afterward. The silence that followed was a different quality from the others. Rita had stopped writing. Celeste had gone very still. That's not a performance issue, Rita said. That's manufactured cause for termination. Yes, Lena said. Celeste looked at Nolan. He was looking at the document on the table. His expression was the one she recognized from the parking lot on her first morning. The one she hadn't had a name for then, but did now. It was the face of a man confronting proof of something he'd always known, but had never been able to hold in his hands. I knew it was manufactured, he said. I didn't have evidence. It's different having evidence. Victor wasn't the program director at the time, Celeste said. That was Harold Greer. Harold Greer retired in 2007, Nolan said. Victor Langley was copied on that memo. Celeste looked at the document, found the CC line, read it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I need until tomorrow morning. Victor will move in the next 48 hours, Nolan said. Maybe sooner. I understand that. She stood up. It was the kind of standing up that meant a decision had been made even if it hadn't been articulated yet. She looked at Nolan for a moment in the way she'd looked at him in the parking lot, with something that had been waiting a long time for the right occasion. I owe you an apology that predates my understanding of what I'm apologizing for. I'm aware that's inadequate. I don't need an apology, Nolan said. I need 72 people to get off that aircraft on the 15th with all the same parts they got on with. Then we want the same thing, Celeste said. She picked up her phone and left the room. Rita began gathering her notes. Lena began reassembling the documentation package. Nolan sat still for a moment, looking at the table, and she let him because she understood that some things needed a moment to be absorbed before you could stand up and carry them differently. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. You built a solid record, he said. The documentation chain, the technical analysis. He looked at her. Your numbers are right. She'd been waiting for that without knowing she was waiting for it. Not praise, it wasn't praise exactly, and she wouldn't have wanted it framed that way. It was the specific acknowledgement of one engineer by another, your work holds up. From another person, it would have been nice to hear. From him, it meant something she didn't have a word for. I learned from a good mechanic, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something in that neighborhood. They took the elevator down together. In the lobby, he stopped to look at the cross-section display of the Etherlift X9 on the far wall, the one she'd looked at on her first morning when she'd been thinking about innovation and integrity and the future of flight. He stood there for a moment, looking at it in the way he'd looked at the building from the parking lot 2 weeks ago. Like something he recognized, like something that owed him a conversation. "It's a good design," he said, "the core of it, even with everything else." He said it without bitterness, which was harder than it sounded. "It's yours," Lena said. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the display. "It's the work," he said. "It doesn't belong to anyone. It just has to be right." They walked out through the lobby doors and into the cool October night. His truck was in the visitor lot. The rust spot on the rear quarter panel caught the parking lot light and looked almost amber in that particular way that rust does when the light hits it from an angle. Less like decay, more like age. He got in. She stood at the passenger door. "I'll take the bus," she said. "I need to think." He looked at her through the open window. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the building behind them. The glass and steel, the lights still on in the executive floors, the faint outline of the research hangar in the distance where an aircraft sat with 72 seats and 12 days left on a countdown that needed to stop. "I'm thinking about what he does next," she said. "Victor, when he finds out it's us." Nolan nodded slowly. "He'll come after the weakest point in the chain," he said. "That's how he works. He doesn't fight the argument. He fights the person making it." He paused. "He'll try to come after you." "I know. And knowing that doesn't change what you're going to do." It wasn't a question. She knew that. He knew the answer already, and she knew he knew it. And that was the closest either of them was going to get to talking about the particular inheritance she'd received from him. Not money, not a name that meant anything in the industry yet, but a specific inability to know something was wrong and do nothing about it. "Get home safe," she said. He nodded. The truck backed out. First try on the engine, same as always. She stood in the parking lot and watched the taillights move toward the exit, and then she turned and looked at the building one more time. Victor Langley's office was on the 5th floor. His light was still on. She looked at it for a moment, then started walking toward the bus stop. He knew someone was pulling threads. He just didn't know yet that the thread led all the way back to the man whose name he'd spent 20 years trying to erase, or that the man's daughter had spent 2 weeks patiently unraveling everything he thought he'd buried, and that by morning Celeste Ashford was going to make a phone call that would change the shape of the next 12 days completely. The night air was cold. She pulled her blazer tighter and kept walking. Celeste made the call at 7:14 the following morning. Lena knew this because Rita texted her at 7:16. "It's moving. Come in early." She was already on the bus. The call Celeste had made was to the firm of Hargrove and Paulson Structural Engineering, a third-party assessment group with federal aviation credentials and a reputation for taking difficult assignments without leaking them to trade publications. Rita had apparently prepared the contact information the night before because when Lena arrived at the 7th floor at 8:02, Rita had a signed authorization letter already printed and a preliminary scope of work drafted. "Celeste signed the access order at 7:45, Rita said, not looking up from her screen. "Hargrove's lead assessor can be on site by Thursday. Full materials testing on the Delta frame composite, independent stress modeling against the original specification, written findings within 7 days of access." "That puts the findings at next Friday at the earliest," Lena said. "The demonstration is the following Monday." 3 days of buffer, Rita said. "Not comfortable, but workable if the findings are unambiguous." "They will be," Lena said. Rita looked up at her. "You sound certain." "The numbers don't change depending on who runs them." Rita studied her for a moment with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was confidence or recklessness. She appeared to decide, provisionally, that it was the former. Victor's assistant called the compliance department at 7:50, asking for a summary of all active review flags on the Etherlift certification files, she said. "Standard request, technically. Except we've never received one before in all the time I've been running this team." He knows. He knows something's happening. He doesn't know the shape of it yet. Rita picked up her pen. He will by the end of today. The access authorization for Hargrove goes through the facilities management system, and Victor's office has visibility on all third-party access requests to the research hangar. How long before he sees it? "Depends on when he checks his queue. Could be an hour, could be this afternoon." She set the pen down. "When he sees it, he's not going to call Celeste first. He's going to call the board." "Which board members?" "The 3 on the program oversight committee. all of whom have personal financial stakes in the defense contract renewal that are not fully disclosed in the public record. Rita said this flatly, without editorializing, the way she said most things. Not illegal exactly, but relevant. Lena sat down at her desk. Her documentation package was in her bag. She'd kept the physical copy with her since Owen's office. She hadn't left it in the building overnight. Her father had called that overcautious when she'd told him. She'd told him it was standard practice for sensitive materials. He'd said that was the same thing as overcautious said differently. She hadn't argued. She opened her laptop and pulled up the certification filing chain. She'd been through it enough times now that she could navigate it without the index, moving directly to the sections that mattered. The 2000T change order, the material specification amendment, the tolerance figure that sat at 4.72, like a fact that had been decided rather than discovered. Her phone buzzed. An internal number she didn't recognize. She answered. Lena Carter. Ms. Carter. The voice was male, measured, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent years in corporate environments and had learned to make authority sound like helpfulness. This is Andrew Fells from the Office of the VP of Engineering. Mr. Langley would like to meet with you this morning, if you have availability. She looked at Rita, who was watching her from across the room. What's the subject? Lena asked. Just a general introduction. Mr. Langley makes a point of meeting new compliance team members in their first month. It's standard. It was not standard. Rita had told her on her first day that Victor Langley hadn't personally met with a compliance team member in 4 years. I have some availability at 11, she said. Mr. Langley was hoping for 9:30. Of course he was. 11 works better for me, she said. Conference room or his office? A brief pause. His office. 5th floor. I'll be there at 11, she said, and ended the call. She looked at Rita. He's moving fast. He's scared, Rita said. Scared people move fast. Usually in the wrong direction. She paused. Do you want me in that meeting? He didn't invite you. No. Then showing up uninvited tells him more than I want him to know right now. She thought for a moment. I'll go alone, but I want to talk to my father before I go in. She called Nolan from the stairwell at 9:15. He answered on the second ring. Victor's office called. He wants a meeting at 11. I expected it sooner, honestly. His voice was calm in the way that wasn't the same as relaxed. It was the calm of someone who had already decided how they were going to handle the range of possible outcomes. What's your read on what he wants? To find the edge of what I know and who I've talked to. And probably to make an offer of some kind, frame it as mentorship or program integration, something that pulls me toward his side before the Hargrove assessment comes back. He'll have done his research on you overnight. He'll know your academic record, your thesis subject, your references. He'll know you're technically credible. That makes you more useful to him than someone he can just dismiss. He'll also know you're my father. He will, Nolan said. And that changes the character of the meeting. You're not just a compliance analyst who found a discrepancy. You're Nolan Carter's daughter, which in Victor's mind means you came into this building with an agenda. A pause. He's not entirely wrong, but his version of that story doesn't include the part where you found the discrepancy yourself before you knew what it connected to. I can use that. Don't oversell it. Let him make assumptions. He's better at this kind of meeting than you are. He's had 20 years of practice. The goal isn't to win the meeting. The goal is to leave it without giving him anything he can use. She thought about that. What would you do in that room? He was quiet for a moment. I'd listen more than I talked, and I'd remember that everything he offers has a hook in it somewhere, even if you can't see it yet. Okay. Lena, a pause. Don't let him make you feel like what you're doing is personal. It isn't personal. It's correct. Those are different things. She stood in the stairwell with that for a moment. Then she said, I'll call you after. Well, Victor Langley's office was the kind of office that had been designed to communicate something. Not wealth exactly. Ether Dynamics was careful about ostentatious displays in its corporate spaces, but authority, and more specifically, the particular authority of someone who understood systems and had positioned himself at the center of this one. The desk was large and clean in the way that meant someone else handled the paper. The windows looked out over the research hangar, and through them, if you stood at the right angle, You could see the tail of the Etherlift X9. Victor himself was 60, silver-haired, and had the physical bearing of a man who had once been athletic and had transitioned into a kind of deliberate stillness that read, at first glance, as confidence. He came around the desk when she entered and shook her hand with both of his, the two-handed shake, which Lena had always found to be a gesture that tried too hard. "Lena," he said, like they'd met before. "Sit down. Can I get you anything? Coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." He sat across from her in the conversation area, two chairs at an angle rather than the power dynamic of desk and visitor, which she noted because it was a choice, and Victor Langley did not make incidental choices. "I should have done this sooner," he said. "I try to meet with new compliance team members in their first month, but the schedule has been—" He made a gesture with his hand that conveyed the crushing weight of being indispensable. "October is always intense around here. I think you probably understand why." "The demonstration flight," she said. "Exactly. 3 years of work coming to a head. It's a significant moment for the company." He smiled. It reached his eyes by about 80%, which was more than most people managed, but less than someone who was actually relaxed. "I've looked at your background. Your thesis work on composite airframe fatigue modeling was impressive. That kind of systems-level thinking is exactly what this program needs going forward." "Thank you," she said. "Compliance is important, don't misunderstand me, but there's a ceiling to what that role offers someone with your capability. I've been thinking about the post-demonstration phase, when the program moves into full production documentation. There's going to be a need for someone who can bridge the engineering team and the regulatory filing process, someone who speaks both languages." He looked at her. "I'd like you to consider a lateral move into the engineering integration group. Better title, better compensation, and you'd be working directly on the production ramp documentation rather than reviewing historical filings." There it was. The offer had arrived faster than she'd expected, which meant he was more concerned than he was showing. "I appreciate that," she said. "Can I ask what prompted the timing? I've been here less than 3 weeks. Good work gets noticed quickly in a company this size." "What specifically did you notice?" A very small pause. "Rita Ochoa mentioned you have strong instincts for documentation chain analysis." Rita had not mentioned that to Victor Langley. Lena was certain of that, which meant he'd been reading the compliance team's internal review logs, which he technically had the authority to do, but which no one in the engineering division had exercised in years. "I've been working through the pre-certification filings," she said carefully. "There are some interesting gaps in the documentation chain. The historical filings have some legacy inconsistencies," Victor said easily. "Things that look like gaps from a compliance perspective, but reflect the document management practices of a different era. We've been meaning to do a formal harmonization project on the pre-2015 records. It's one of those things that keeps getting pushed back by more immediate priorities." He said all of this smoothly and without any particular emphasis, which was the tell. When someone describes something complicated in a tone of flat reasonableness, they've rehearsed the description. "The inconsistencies I found weren't limited to the pre-2015 records," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. It was brief, and it was controlled, but it was there. "No?" "The baseline specification for the Delta frame assembly. The tolerance figure in the current certification package doesn't match the validated test data in the original engineering record." She said it in the same tone he'd used, conversational, undramatic, like she was describing a filing discrepancy and not the thing she'd spent 3 weeks building a case around. "I flagged it through the standard process." "I saw that flag," he said. "Our internal team reviewed it. The current specification reflects design modifications made during the 2020 redesign phase. There's a change order that documents the adjustment." "I found the change order," she said. "It documents the modification. It doesn't include an independent validation of the revised tolerance figure against real materials testing data." "That's the kind of technical nuance that really requires the full engineering context to evaluate properly," Victor said. "Which is exactly why I think you'd benefit from working within the engineering integration group rather than reviewing these files without that context." He smiled again. Same 80%. "These filings can look alarming from a pure documentation standpoint when the underlying engineering rationale is sound." "Is there a materials test report I should be looking at?" she asked, "for the 2020 composite specification?" A pause. I'd need to check what's in the current archive. I've been through the current archive pretty thoroughly, she said. I haven't found one. The pause this time was longer and colder, and the 80% smile had dropped to something closer to 60. Lena, he said, and the tone had shifted, not to overt hostility, but to the register that authority figures use when they want you to understand that the conversation has moved into a different category. I want to be direct with you, because I think you're smart enough to appreciate directness. You're 3 weeks into your career at this company. You're working from historical documents that you don't have the full technical context to interpret. And I'm aware that your father has a complicated history with this program. He paused. I want to make sure that history isn't coloring the way you're interpreting what you're finding. There it was. She'd expected it. Hearing it still took a moment to absorb. My analysis is based on the documentation record, she said, not on personal history. I'm sure that's how it feels, he said. But perception matters in a company like this. If the compliance team appears to be pursuing a line of inquiry that's driven by a personal grievance rather than legitimate technical concerns, it compromises the credibility of the entire department. He let that sit for a moment. I'm trying to protect you from that position. She looked at him. He was good at this. She gave him that. The frame he'd constructed was elegant. If she pushed back, she was being defensive about the personal grievance angle. If she accepted the reframe, she'd handed him the characterization he needed. It was the same move that had been used against her father 19 years ago. Not a direct attack, but a repositioning of the person making the legitimate argument into someone whose motives could be questioned. I appreciate the concern, she said, keeping her voice even. I'll make sure my documentation is thorough enough to stand on its own merits. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, think about the offer. The engineering integration role. It's a genuine opportunity. He stood, which ended the meeting on his terms. Give it a few days. She stood, shook his hand, one hand this time from his side. I will, she said. She left his office and walked to the elevator and rode it to the 7th floor and sat down at her desk and spent approximately 45 seconds looking at her screen without seeing it. Then she opened the documentation package and started preparing for the board meeting. Victor moved within 6 hours. By 3 in the afternoon, Celeste had received formal communications from 2 of the 3 Program Oversight Committee members requesting an emergency briefing on what they described as unauthorized third-party access to restricted program assets, meaning the Hargrove Assessment Authorization. By 4, Victor had circulated a memo to the full engineering leadership team characterizing the independent review as a compliance department procedural anomaly, stemming from misinterpretation of legacy documentation by a junior analyst. He'd used those words, junior analyst. Rita brought the memo to Lena's desk without comment. Lena read it twice. The phrase was calculated. It wasn't technically inaccurate, but it was designed to reduce her to a category that didn't require serious engagement. Junior, analyst, someone who could be explained away. He's going to the board, Lena said. He's already called the meeting, Rita said. Tomorrow at 2. He's framed it as a program status briefing, but Celeste has seen the agenda. It's a preemptive strike. He's going to present the October 15th timeline as non-negotiable and the Hargrove assessment as an unauthorized disruption to a certified program. Can Celeste counter? She's the CEO. She can present whatever she wants, but she needs something to present. Rita looked at her. The Hargrove team isn't on site until Thursday. The assessment won't be complete before the board meeting. Then we don't use the assessment, Lena said. We use what we already have. She called Nolan. Board meeting tomorrow at 2. Victor's framing. I need you there. A long pause. In the building. In the building, in the room. Celeste needs a credentialed voice on the technical argument. Owen can corroborate the historical record, but he's been in this building for 23 years, and Victor will use that. You're the only person in this who Victor can't contextualize within the company's power structure. He'll try to contextualize me as a disgruntled former employee. And you'll have your name on a federal patent filing that predates his VP title by 2 years, she said. Let him try. Another pause. What time do you need me there? 1 o'clock. So we have time before the meeting. All right? Dad. She stopped. Bring your copy of the patent documentation and the original letter, the one you wrote to the board. I burned that letter in 2000s, he said. Her heart dropped slightly. Owen's copy? Is a copy, he said. I know, but the federal patent filing is an original on record. That's enough. A pause. And I have something else. I kept one thing, a recording. She went very still. A recording of what? A meeting. October 2004. Harold Greer's office. He offered me a settlement, my silence in exchange for a consulting fee paid through a subsidiary. I told him I needed to think about it. I went back to my office and I wrote down everything that had been said, word for word, while it was still fresh. A pause. And I'd had a recorder in my jacket pocket. The stairwell she was standing in felt suddenly much quieter. You recorded the meeting, she said. I'd been carrying the documentation folder for 3 days at that point. I wasn't naive about what was happening. His voice was entirely level. The recording is 31 minutes. Harold Greer explicitly acknowledges the safety concern your father raised. He caught himself. That I raised. I explicitly acknowledges it as legitimate, and then offers payment in exchange for withdrawal of the regulatory complaint. That's not just a personnel issue, she said. That's evidence of deliberate suppression of a safety finding in exchange for financial consideration. Yes, he said, and Victor Langley is audible in the last 8 minutes. He came into the meeting toward the end. He didn't offer anything explicitly, but he's on the recording. She pressed her back against the stairwell wall. 19 years. He had carried that recording for 19 years in the same patient, quiet way he carried everything. Not waiting for revenge, not building toward a confrontation, just keeping it the way he kept the documentation folder. Because evidence without the right moment is just paper, or in this case, just audio. Why didn't you ever use it? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because after they removed me, I had a 2-year-old daughter and no income and a legal fight I couldn't afford against a company with a 9-figure legal budget. He paused. And then life kept moving, and you got older, and I kept thinking there would be a better moment that never quite came. Another pause. Until it did. The board meeting the next day was held in the main conference room on the executive floor, a room designed for exactly this kind of gathering, with a long table that could seat 20 and audio-visual equipment built into the ceiling. 14 people were present, 8 board members, Celeste, Victor, his chief engineer, 2 members of the program oversight committee, and because Celeste had exercised her CEO authority to include external technical consultants in program-critical discussions. Nolan Carter. Victor saw him when he walked in and went completely still for approximately 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than a man who was completely confident would need. Nolan sat beside Lena and across from Owen Marsh, who had come at Rita's request, and who looked like a man who had spent 23 years waiting to be useful and was finally getting the opportunity. Rita sat at the end of the table nearest the door. She had her legal pad. She had her reading glasses where they were supposed to be. Victor recovered quickly. He opened the meeting with the efficiency of someone who had prepared and intended to maintain control of the room. He presented the October 15th demonstration flight as the culmination of 3 years of engineering and regulatory work, walked through the defense contract renewal timeline, and characterized the Hargrove assessment authorization as a well-intentioned but procedurally premature action by the compliance department based on a misreading of legacy documentation. He was, Lena acknowledged privately, very good at this. He didn't attack. He explained. He framed the problem as a communications gap that he was committed to addressing through a clear documentation harmonization process going forward. He made it sound like a systems improvement opportunity and not a cover-up, which was the more comfortable frame for the board members who had financial stakes in the outcome. Then he said, I also want to address the presence of an outside individual in this meeting. Nolan Carter was a company employee approximately 20 years ago who departed under circumstances that raised conduct concerns. His involvement with the current review appears to have begun through a family connection to a junior compliance analyst, and I want the board to have that context when evaluating the concerns that have been raised. He said it calmly. He said it as a courtesy, as someone providing the board with relevant background rather than as someone discrediting a witness before they could speak. It was the same move he'd used in her office the day before, scaled to an audience. Lena looked at her father. He was looking at Victor with the expression she now recognized as his working expression, the quality of attention he gave to a problem before he decided how to address it. Then he put a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it toward the center. "Before we go further," Nolan said in his quiet, flat voice, "I'd like to provide the board with my full technical credential history, since Mr. Langley has raised the question of context." He nodded at the paper. "That includes my USPTO patent filing for the Etherlift Core Safety Integration Architecture, filed in 2003, which is the foundational framework that the current X9 design derives from. The federal registration number is at the top." One of the board members, an older man at the far end of the table who had been quiet until now, leaned forward and looked at the paper. "The conduct concern Mr. Langley referenced," Nolan continued, "was a conduct investigation opened in October 2004, 2 weeks after I filed a formal safety objection with this board regarding the Delta frame composite modification. I was never formally charged under that investigation, and no finding was ever issued, because the investigation was not opened in response to a reported allegation. It was open to remove me from the program before I could complete a regulatory complaint." He paused. "I have documentation of this." Lena placed the folder on the table. The Harold Greer memo, CC'd to Victor Langley, was on top. Victor looked at it. The 60% smile had gone entirely. "I also have an audio recording from a meeting in October 2004, in which the program director at the time acknowledged my safety finding as technically valid and offered financial consideration in exchange for my withdrawal of the pending regulatory complaint." Nolan looked at the board. "Mr. Langley was present for a portion of that meeting." The room was very quiet. Victor said, "Any such recording would have been obtained without consent and would be inadmissible." "This isn't a courtroom," Celeste said. Her voice was even and final. "And the admissibility of a recording doesn't determine whether the board hears it." Victor looked at her. It was a look that had probably worked in many previous rooms with many previous people who had more to lose than she did. Celeste held it without apparent difficulty. The recording played through the conference room speakers. 31 minutes. Harold Greer's voice, then Nolan's voice, then, in the final 8 minutes, a third voice that 3 of the people in the room recognized without being told whose it was. When it ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Lena opened the documentation package and began. She had structured it the way her father had structured his original letter to the board 19 years ago. The way she'd recognized when she'd read it in Owen's folder. Not because she'd been taught to do it that way, but because apparently this was how their minds organized information. Start with the baseline fact. Build the chain. Don't editorialize. Let the numbers carry the weight. She walked through the 2004 stress analysis. She walked through the 2006 modification approval. She walked through the 2020 change order and the absence of independent materials validation. She presented the current certification package's tolerance figure, 4.72, and placed beside it the figure that an independent materials test would produce, 4.18. And she explained in terms that a non-engineer could follow because her father had taught her to do that, exactly what the difference between those two numbers meant at 40,000 feet under full load. She was precise. She was not dramatic. She had learned from the best. Victor interrupted twice. Both times Nolan answered the technical objection without raising his voice, and both times the answer was sufficient because the numbers were what they were, and they didn't change because someone needed them to be different. At the end, one of the board members, not the quiet older man at the end, but a woman in her 50s who had said almost nothing through Victor's presentation, looked at Celeste and said, "What does the Hargrove assessment need to complete its findings?" 7 days of site access, Celeste said, starting Thursday. And the demonstration flight? Would need to be postponed pending the findings and any required remediation. The woman looked at Victor. "Do you have a materials test report for the 2020 composite specification?" Victor was quiet for a moment. Then, "The internal review process at the time. Do you have a materials test report?" A silence that lasted long enough to answer the question on its own. "No," he said finally. The vote on the Hargrove assessment took 11 minutes to organize and 40 seconds to conduct. 12 in favor. Victor abstained. His chief engineer abstained. The launch postponement was contingent on the assessment findings, but Celeste moved immediately to implement a voluntary hold pending review, which she had the authority to do unilaterally. Victor sat very still through all of it, which was worse, in a way, than if he'd argued. After the formal vote, as people began to gather their things, one of the program oversight committee members who had previously been aligned with Victor walked around the table and said something quietly to his colleague that Lena didn't catch. But she saw the expression on the face of the man he spoke to, the particular expression of someone recalculating risk, deciding that the ship they'd been standing on was listing, and the question was no longer how to keep it level, but how to get off. She looked at her father. He was closing the folder. He'd taken his copy of the patent documentation back. He hadn't asked for anything from the board. Not an acknowledgement, not an apology, not an offer. He'd presented what was true, answered what was asked, and was now apparently preparing to leave in the same manner he'd arrived. Nolan. It was the quiet older board member from the far end of the table. He'd stood up and was moving around toward them. He was perhaps 70, with the look of someone who had been present for enough corporate cycles to maintain his own calibration, regardless of which way the room was moving. I've been on this board for 11 years. I looked at the original project files when I joined. I saw your name on the architectural documentation. Nolan looked at him. I should have asked more questions at the time, the man said. I didn't. Nolan nodded once. It's a complicated record to navigate without the right context, he said. He wasn't making it easy for the man, but he wasn't making it harder either. The board member looked at him for another moment, then nodded and walked away. Victor left the room without speaking to anyone. His chief engineer followed 2 steps behind, in the way that suggested the chief engineer was already internally composing a revised version of his own role in the events of the past 3 years. Lena stood beside her father as the room emptied and looked out the window at the research hangar, where the Etherlift X9 sat with its demonstration postponed and its structural composition about to be examined by people with no stake in the outcome other than the correct answer. That was the recording, she said quietly. That was the recording, he agreed. 19 years. He picked up the folder and held it under his arm. Some things have to wait for the right weight behind them. You said that to me once, actually. You were about 9. You wanted me to let you stay up to watch the end of a movie, and I kept saying it wasn't the right night. You said, Dad, some things need to wait until they have enough weight to matter. You were talking about the movie, but I kept thinking about it afterward. She looked at him. I don't remember saying that. I do, he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. He's not done, she said. Victor, the board vote doesn't end it for him. No, Nolan agreed, but the recording changes his position considerably. He can fight the technical findings. He will fight them, through whatever channels he has left. But he can't fight a recording of himself in a room where a safety concern was being traded for silence. The Federal Aviation Authorities will have a different set of questions than the board does. He paused. Let them ask. He walked toward the door. She picked up her documentation package and followed, and they walked out of the conference room together and down the corridor toward the elevator, and through the lobby with its cross-section display of the Etherlift X9, catching the afternoon light, and out through the glass doors and into the October afternoon where the sky was the kind of clear blue that made everything look more resolvable than it was. His truck was in the visitor lot. The rust spot caught the afternoon sun the same way it caught the parking lot lights at night. Differently colored, same essential truth about something that had been through a lot of weather and was still holding together. Are you coming back tomorrow? She asked. Hargrove needs the original stress analysis for the independent assessment, he said. Owen has the full set, but there are calibration notes in the original test data that aren't in his copies. I still have the originals. You kept the originals. I told you, I kept a lot of things. She looked at him. The canvas jacket, the worn boots, the same face she'd been looking at her whole life, and had only recently started to actually see. I put you in the lower lot, she said, on the first day. He looked at her. I was embarrassed about the truck and I asked you to stay in the lower lot. And you said it's okay. And you meant it, which made it worse. She held his gaze. It wasn't okay. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment, not a managed silence this time, an honest one. You didn't know, he said. I should have known better regardless of what I knew. Maybe, he said. But you also just walked into a board meeting with 12 years of documented evidence and presented it in front of the man who spent 20 years trying to make sure it never saw the light of day. He paused. I think on balance, you get to keep the apology for something more serious. She almost laughed. It came out as something less than that, but in the same vicinity. He got in the truck. The engine turned over. "First thing tomorrow," he said through the window. "I'll bring the originals." She stood in the visitor lot as the truck pulled out, and she thought about her father driving home to a repair shop on Alderman Street, and about an aircraft sitting in a hangar waiting to be examined by people who would find what they were going to find, and about a recording that had existed for 19 years in the same quiet patience as the man who'd made it. Behind her, the Ether Dynamics building caught the afternoon light and held it, the way institutions hold things, long after anyone meant them to. The Hargrove team arrived on Thursday morning in 2 vehicles, a company van carrying equipment cases and a black sedan carrying the lead assessor, a woman named Dr. Caroline Voss, who had spent 26 years doing structural analysis for aviation programs and had the manner of someone who had been lied to by enough engineers to have developed a reliable detection system for it. She shook Nolan's hand in the lobby and said, "I read your 2004 stress analysis last night. The calibration methodology was ahead of what most firms were doing at the time." "It got the right number," he said. "That's all it needed to do." She looked at him for a moment. "Let's see what the current material tells us." They gave her full access to the research hangar. Celeste had signed the authorization herself, which meant facilities management couldn't slow-walk the clearance the way they might have under ordinary circumstances. The Hargrove team moved into this hangar with the particular efficiency of people who had done this in places where cooperation was considerably less forthcoming, and within 2 hours they had sample cores drawn from the Delta frame primary joint and were running the first round of materials testing in the temporary lab space they'd set up in the hangar's annex room. Lena spent that first day managing the documentation trail, making sure every access log, every sample extraction record, every chain of custody notation was complete and time-stamped, because she understood now that the value of correct findings depended entirely on the integrity of the process that produced them. She'd learned that from her father's original case, in which the findings had been correct and the process had been impeccable. And it still hadn't been enough, because the people who controlled the institutional record had simply rewritten it. This time, the record was going to be built in a way that couldn't be quietly reclassified. Victor Langley did not appear in the hangar. He did not appear at any of the daily briefings Celeste ran during the assessment week. His name appeared twice in internal communications, once in a memo requesting a legal review of the Hargrove authorization process, and once in what Rita described as a fairly aggressive email to 2 board members, the content of which Celeste declined to share, but the existence of which she mentioned matter-of-factly in a way that said she was tracking it. On the 3rd day of the assessment, Dr. Voss came to find Lena at her desk. "I want to show you something," she said. They went to the hangar annex. On the work table, sample cross-sections from the Delta frame primary joint were arranged in a row under examination lighting. Dr. Voss pointed to the 3rd sample from the left. "See the grain structure here?" She indicated a region near the edge of the sample. "This is what fatigue initiation looks like in this class of composite under cyclical high-load stress. It's microscopic. You wouldn't see it in a standard visual inspection. You wouldn't even catch it with conventional, non-destructive testing unless you knew exactly where to look and what you were looking for." She looked at Lena. "This aircraft has not yet flown a full demonstration profile. This degradation pattern is from ground testing and taxi operations only." Lena looked at the sample. "It's already initiating. The material is performing exactly as your father's 2004 model predicted it would, under the accumulated stress load, the fatigue threshold under the demonstration flight profile." Dr. Voss paused, choosing her words with care. "Would not need to be a catastrophic failure event on the demonstration flight itself. But the frame would exit that flight with structural compromise that would be undetectable by standard post-flight inspection. And at some point in the operational life of that aircraft, under the right conditions, it wouldn't need to be a catastrophic failure on the first flight," Lena said quietly, almost to herself. She was repeating it not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because she needed to hear the full weight of it. 72 people on a demonstration flight, then the aircraft entering certification, then production, then thousands of people over years. "No," Dr. Voss said, "it wouldn't." Lena called her father from the hangar parking lot. "Voss found initiation patterns," she said. "3rd sample. Ground operations only." She heard him exhale. A long, slow breath that she'd never heard from him before. Not relief exactly. More the sound of a person setting down something that had been very heavy for a very long time. How far along, he asked. Early stage, but consistent with the model. Good, he said. And then, after a pause, not good that it's there. Good that it's findable. Good that it's findable now. Yes, she said. That. The Federal Aviation Authority investigators arrived on day 5 of the assessment, which was earlier than anyone had expected. Celeste had filed a voluntary disclosure with the regulatory agency on the day after the board meeting, a decision she made, as she told Rita, because the alternative was waiting for the findings to become public through a channel she didn't control, and she would rather be the one who walked through the door than the one who got it knocked down. The investigators were professional, thorough, and asked questions that made it clear they had read not only the current certification filings, but the pre-2019 supplemental records and a certain federal patent registration that had been filed by a certain chief engineer in 2003. They interviewed Nolan for 4 hours on day 6. He brought the original calibration notes. He brought the audio recording, which he transferred to them with a formal evidence chain document that he had, characteristically, prepared before anyone asked for it. He answered every question directly and without editorializing, and when the lead investigator asked him why he had kept the recording for 19 years without filing a formal regulatory complaint, he said, "Because at the time I filed it, I had a 2-year-old daughter and no ability to sustain a regulatory fight against an organization with unlimited legal resources, and because I believed the correct moment would come." He paused. It came. The lead investigator looked at him for a moment, then wrote something in his notes and moved on. Victor Langley was placed on administrative leave by the board on day 7, while the Hargrove assessment was still in progress. The formal communication cited pending review of program oversight decisions, the kind of corporate language that means everything and commits to nothing, but which everyone in the building understood. His chief engineer submitted a written statement to the federal investigators that afternoon, which Rita described to Lena as extensive, and left it there. The Hargrove final report was delivered on day 8. Dr. Voss presented the findings in a meeting with Celeste, the board, and 2 federal investigators. 37 pages. The conclusion section was 4 paragraphs, and the relevant finding was in the second paragraph. The Delta frame composite in the current Etherlift X-9 aircraft showed material fatigue initiation consistent with an inadequate structural tolerance specification, and the aircraft was not certifiable for passenger operations in its current configuration without remediation of the affected structural elements and independent revalidation of the Delta frame assembly design. The October 15th demonstration flight was formally canceled that afternoon. Lena heard about it from Rita, who came to her desk, sat down in the adjacent chair, something Rita had never done before, and said, "It's done." Lena looked at her screen for a moment. Then she said, "Has Victor been formally notified?" "His attorney was notified, which is now the relevant channel." Rita paused. "The federal investigators have opened a formal inquiry into the 2004 conduct investigation and the nature of the original safety finding suppression. That process is going to take some time, but it's opened." "And the program?" "Celeste is announcing a voluntary program restructure Monday morning, full redesign of the Delta frame assembly, independent safety oversight panel established before any future certification attempts, complete reissuance of the engineering record under transparent attribution." Rita looked at her. "Your father's name goes back on the foundational documentation." Lena was quiet for a moment. "He'll say that's not important," she said. "I know," Rita said, "but Celeste is doing it anyway." She drove to the shop on Alderman Street that evening. She'd been there 1,000 times, obviously. She'd grown up moving through that space the way you move through any place that has always been there without particularly seeing it. The smell of it. The specific quality of the light from the fluorescent tubes mounted to the underside of the car lifts. The radio that was always on, always tuned to the same station, the volume set low enough to be more texture than sound. The coffee maker on the workbench that had been there since she was small, and that made coffee that was slightly too strong and slightly too hot, and that her father drank without complaint because he had made it, and he didn't believe in complaining about his own work. He was under a 2015 Civic when she arrived, visible only from the knees down. She stood in the doorway and watched the familiar shape of him and thought about how many times she'd stood in this doorway in her life, after school, after bad days, after the years when he was the only constant she could count on, and she'd taken that constancy for granted the way you take gravity for granted, which is to say completely and without acknowledgement. "I know you're there," he said from under the car. "You always stop in the doorway." "The flight's been canceled," she said, formally. "The program is being restructured. Celeste is putting your name back on the foundational documentation." A pause. She heard the sound of a wrench being set down on the concrete. He rolled out from under the car on the creeper, in the unhurried way he did everything. He sat up and looked at her from the floor, which was not a dignified position from which to receive significant news and which he appeared entirely unbothered by. "Good," he said. "That's it? Good? What else do you want me to say?" "I don't know, something that reflects the scale of what just happened." He looked at her. He had grease on his forearm and on the side of his left hand, and his reading glasses were pushed up on his head because he'd been reading something before he went under the car. He looked exactly like himself. "The scale of what happened," he said slowly, "is that 72 people are going to get on an aircraft someday that's been built correctly, and they're going to get off it again, and they're not going to know anything about the 20 years of decisions that went into making that possible. And that's exactly how it should work. That's what safety engineering is. You don't get a parade when you do it right. You just get the absence of the bad thing." She leaned against the doorframe. "Victor's under investigation." "I know." "Are you, I don't know, satisfied?" He thought about that for a moment, which she appreciated. He didn't give reflexive answers to questions that deserved real ones. "What he did caused real damage," Nolan said. "To the program, to the people on the original design team who left, to whatever version of my life existed in a world where that didn't happen." He looked at the floor for a moment. "But I stopped needing Victor Langley to suffer for it a long time ago. What I needed was for the aircraft to be safe and for the record to be corrected. Those things are happening." He looked up at her. "That's sufficient." She thought about the recording. 19 years in a drawer somewhere, in whatever storage medium he'd kept it on, waiting. Not in anger. Not in the specific burning patience of someone planning revenge. Just kept. Because it was true, and true things deserve to be preserved. "You're a strange person," she said. "You say that like it's a recent discovery." "It's a recent understanding of a long-standing observation." He got up from the creeper in the careful way of someone whose knees had accumulated a certain amount of history. He picked up the wrench and set it on the workbench. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the old maker and held it without drinking it. "How are you doing?" he asked. She considered the question. She'd been in her position at Ether Dynamics for 3 weeks and had already been involved in a board confrontation, a federal investigation, and the cancellation of a billion-dollar demonstration flight. She had also, in the same 3 weeks, learned more about her father than she had in the preceding 23 years of her life. "I think I'm okay," she said. "I think I'm going to keep being okay." "Good." He looked at his coffee. "Rita Ochoa seems like a solid person." "She is." "She knew what you'd found before you did. On the first day, she knew the shape of it." "I think a lot of people in that building have known the shape of it for a long time," Lena said. "They just needed someone with less to lose to pick it up." He nodded. "That's how these things usually go. Someone new walks in without knowing which questions aren't supposed to be asked." He looked at her. "You walked in and asked every one of them." "I didn't know they weren't supposed to be asked." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." She stayed for 2 hours. She had the too strong coffee, which she didn't complain about either, and they sat on the old wooden stools at the workbench while he finished a brake job on a car that belonged to someone he'd been servicing for 12 years, and they talked. Not about the program, not about Victor or the board or the federal investigation, but about actual things. She told him about Derek from orientation, who had eventually revealed he was terrified of elevators and had been taking the stairs to the 7th floor every day. She told him about a calculation error she'd found in a training document that had apparently been circulating uncorrected for 4 years. He told her about a transmission he'd misdiagnosed last month that had cost him 3 extra hours and a considerable amount of private profanity. They talked the way people talk when the large things have been said and there's room again for the small ones. At some point, she realized that this was what had been missing, not the information about his past, not the explanation of who he'd been before the shop, but this, the specific ease of 2 people who have gotten through something difficult together and found that they are still, on the other side of it, themselves. She drove home at 9:30 with the windows down, in the October air that had the particular sharpness of a season changing its mind about how warm it still wanted to be. The months that followed moved the way consequential things do, faster in retrospect than they felt at the time. Victor Langley resigned in November, ahead of the formal conclusion of the federal inquiry, in a statement prepared by his attorneys that expressed regret for decisions made under significant program pressure, without directly admitting to anything, which satisfied no one entirely, but was the kind of outcome that large institutional processes frequently produce. The federal inquiry continued regardless and resulted, the following spring, in findings that were forwarded to the relevant prosecutorial authorities. What happened after that moved into the slow machinery of legal process, which Lena followed in the trade press with the detached attention of someone who had already gotten what they came for. The EtherLift X9 redesign program was announced publicly in November. Celeste gave a press statement that was notable for being one of the most direct corporate acknowledgments of a safety failure that most observers could remember. She named the original design flaw, described the nature of the suppression, acknowledged that the company had benefited for 2 decades from engineering work that had not been properly attributed, and announced the creation of an independent safety oversight panel that would have regulatory authority over all future certification decisions. The panel's charter explicitly prohibited program leadership from having override authority on safety findings. It was the kind of structural change that gets proposed often and implemented rarely, and its presence in the redesign plan was, in the opinion of most industry observers, either a genuine commitment or an extremely expensive performance. Time, as with all such things, would be the judge. Owen Marsh retired in December, earlier than he'd planned, with a pension that had been quietly enhanced by a board decision that nobody formally explained. He sent Lena a card that said, in his neat, slightly cramped handwriting, "You have his way of getting to the point. That's not nothing." She put it on her desk at the office and left it there. Nolan Carter's name was restored to the foundational engineering documentation in December as well, in a formal reissuance of the company's technical record. His attribution on the core safety integration architecture was acknowledged in the redesign program's baseline documentation. Celeste held a small internal ceremony. She'd offered a public event, and he had declined with the specificity of someone who has thought about it and is certain, at which she presented him with a document confirming the restoration of his professional record, and said, in front of approximately 30 people, "This company survived because of his work twice. Once when he built the architecture that made the program possible, and once when he came back to make sure we didn't destroy it." He accepted the document with the brief nod of someone who has waited a long time for a thing and finds, upon receiving it, that the waiting was the heavier part. He said thank you. He did not give a speech. Lena watched from the side of the room and thought about something she'd read once, that the people who build the foundations of things rarely get to stand on the roof and wave. Usually they're already somewhere else by the time the building is finished, and by the time anyone thinks to look down at what they're standing on, the builder's name has worn off the cornerstone. It takes someone with the patience to get down on their knees and look closely to find it. She was glad she'd looked. The delayed demonstration flight was rescheduled for the following March, after the redesigned Delta frame assembly had passed independent structural validation and the full certification package had been reissued under independent review. Dr. Caroline Voss was on the independent oversight panel. She had accepted the appointment with the same manner she'd brought to the hangar, matter-of-fact, precise, and without visible ego about the role. On the morning of the demonstration flight, Lena drove herself to the campus in her own car. She'd bought it 3 months earlier, a used Honda, 7 years old, reliable without being impressive, which suited her. She parked in the employee lot on the upper tier because she was now a full compliance analyst on the Safety Oversight Integration Team, a position that came with a Tier 2 parking credential and that she had earned through 3 months of work that had nothing to do with anything her father had done, which was exactly the point. She was part of the compliance team observing the pre-flight inspection. She stood in the hangar with her clipboard and her clearance badge and went through the checklist the way the checklist was meant to be used, thoroughly, without abbreviation, because that was how you prevented the particular category of disaster that results from deciding that close enough is good enough on the things that matter most. The aircraft looked the same from the outside. Same white fuselage, same swept wings, same tail fin that she'd seen on her first morning rising above the buildings in the early light. But the Delta frame assembly was new, fabricated from the correct composite, to the correct specification, with test reports attached to every material batch and calibration notes accessible in the open documentation system under the name of the engineer who had originally defined the standard. She completed her checklist. She signed off. She walked out of the hangar into the March morning, which was cold and clear and the kind of blue that makes everything look straightforward. Her phone buzzed. Her father. How does it look? She looked at the aircraft through the open hangar doors, thought about the grain structure of a composite sample under examination lighting, thought about a stress tolerance figure, not 4.72, not the number someone had decided was close enough, but the number the material actually delivered under the conditions it would actually face. 4.18 had been the threshold of the old material's failure. The new specification cleared it by a margin that Dr. Voss had described in her written certification as structurally conservative and fully validated. Looks right, she typed back. 3 dots appeared. Then, good. Then, come by the shop after. I'll make soup. She smiled at her phone in the March cold, standing in the shadow of an aircraft that was going to fly correctly because the work underneath it had finally been allowed to be what it was. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. The demonstration flight launched at 10:12 that morning. 70 passengers. The number had been reduced from 72 by a scheduling change, which was the kind of mundane detail that the universe occasionally provides to remind you that not everything is symbolic. The flight profile was exactly what the original design had been built for. Extended high-altitude cruise at operating ceiling, full fuel load, complete operational envelope. It lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. It landed without incident, with every telemetry reading within the validated parameters. The Delta frame assembly performing exactly as the corrected specification predicted. Lena was in the observation area when it landed. She watched the aircraft touch down with the specific attention of someone who understands what they're looking at. Not the graceful sight of it, not the milestone achievement of a great company narrative that the press team would write up later, but the structural reality of it. 70 people at 40,000 feet in an aircraft built on a foundation that had been correctly designed and correctly built and correctly validated because someone had refused to sign his name to a lie 19 years ago and had kept the evidence of that refusal in a drawer until the right moment arrived. She thought about what it cost to be that kind of person. Not in the dramatic sense, the board meeting, the recording, the confrontation, but in the daily sense. The 20 years of Nolan Carter getting up in the morning and going to a repair shop and doing honest work and raising his daughter and carrying a weight that he'd chosen not to put down because putting it down would have meant pretending it wasn't there. The particular discipline of a person who knows what they know and waits and waits and doesn't become bitter about the waiting and doesn't make their child carry the weight of it and still manages to be, by any measure that actually matters, a good man and a present father, and someone who says it's okay when it isn't entirely okay and means it as a forward-looking statement rather than a description of the present. She didn't know if she could do that. She hoped she'd never have to find out. But she understood it now in a way she hadn't before, and understanding it changed her estimation of him in a direction she hadn't thought possible, because she'd already thought quite highly of him. The aircraft was met by ground crew and led to the observation area where the gathered press and company representatives had assembled. Celeste stood near the front of the group in her usual composed posture, watching the aircraft approach with an expression that was hard to read from a distance, but that looked to Lena like someone who had finally paid a debt they'd been carrying since before they knew they owed it. Later that day, after the press briefing and the regulatory acknowledgement and the internal all-hands that Celeste ran for the full company, Lena drove to Alderman Street. He had the shop closed by the time she arrived, which was unusual for a weekday afternoon, and she found him sitting on the bench outside the side entrance with 2 cups of coffee, the 2 strong kind from the old maker, waiting with the patience of someone who had decided some time ago that waiting was simply one of the things a person did, and that it was better to do it with coffee than without. She sat beside him. She took the cup he handed her. She drank it without complaining about the strength, because she had decided somewhere in the past 4 months that she was going to stop complaining about the coffee. They sat for a while without talking, in the way that people can sit without talking when they've gotten through something together, and the silence is no longer the uneasy kind. Rita offered me a senior position, she said after a while, on the Permanent Safety Oversight Integration Team. It's a real role, not a title. External review coordination, independent panel liaison, that kind of work. Are you going to take it? I think so. I want to do it in a way where nobody can say I got it because of what happened. Nobody who matters will say that. The people who don't matter will say it loudly enough for the people who matter to hear it. He was quiet for a moment. Probably, he said. Take it anyway. You'll make it yours quickly enough that the argument will run out of oxygen. She looked at her coffee. You could consult on the redesign program. Celeste asked. I know she asked. She asked, he confirmed. And? And I told her I had a Civic with a timing belt that needed attention and 3 other jobs backed up. He paused. I said I'd think about it. Will you? He looked out at Alderman Street, at the ordinary traffic of an ordinary afternoon, at the kind of street that exists in every city and that nobody writes about because nothing notable happens on it, which is the point, which is the whole point of a street like this. I built the thing I wanted to build, he said. Watching someone else build it correctly that's sufficient. That's actually more than sufficient. He drank his coffee. What I do here is useful. People bring me something broken and I fix it, and they drive away and their car works. There's a clarity to that I'm not in a hurry to give up. She thought about that. About the difference between the work that gets your name on a patent and the work that gets your hands dirty, and neither one being more real than the other, and neither one being something to be embarrassed about, and the waste of years she'd spent not fully understanding that. I was embarrassed, she said, for a long time. About the shop, about the truck, about... She gestured vaguely. The whole picture. I spent years being half proud of you and half wishing you were something easier to explain. He listened. He didn't say it's okay this time. I know, he said. I'm not unaware of how it looked. You never said anything. What would I have said? Something. Anything. He looked at his coffee. I thought about it, telling you more, earlier. But there's a version of that where it becomes where you grow up carrying my grievance instead of your own life. I didn't want that for you. He paused. I wanted you to walk into that building on your own merits and find your own footing and be your own engineer, not a correction of a wrong done to your father. That's a bad reason to do anything. She thought about the first day, the blazer, the visitor lot, the way she'd said I can walk from here and hated herself for saying it before the words had finished leaving her mouth. She thought about, it's okay, Lena. Forward-looking, she understood now. Already aimed at this. At the two of them sitting on this bench with their coffee, having gotten through all of it and arrived here, which was not a triumphant place exactly, but was a true one. You should have told me, she said. I still think you should have told me. Probably, he said. Parenting is mostly doing your best with incomplete information and hoping the gaps aren't the ones that matter most. Was that your philosophy? That was my experience. I'm not sure it qualifies as a philosophy. She smiled. The March afternoon had gone the cool side of mild, and the light on Alderman Street had taken on the particular gold of late afternoon in a season that still couldn't quite decide if it was winter or spring. In her bag was a copy of the Hargrove Final Report and a printout of the new certification baseline documentation, at the top of which, under the heading Foundational Engineering Attribution, her father's name appeared in clean type. Nolan A. Carter, Chief Engineer, Ether Lift Core Safety Integration Architecture. She'd printed it because she thought he should have a copy. She hadn't decided yet whether to give it to him tonight or let it wait. She thought about what this story actually was. Not the version the press would write, the safety scandal, the whistleblower's return, the corporate reckoning. Those things had happened and they mattered. But the story underneath that story was smaller and more ordinary. A man who had done honest work and been punished for it. Who had continued doing honest work in a smaller arena, without bitterness and without performance. Who had raised a daughter alone and had tried, imperfectly, to give her the tools she would need without giving her his damage along with them. Who had waited 19 years for the right moment and had recognized it when it came in the form of his daughter, walking into a company whose foundations he'd built and starting to pull the threads. The real question, the one she'd been sitting with for months, was what you were supposed to do with a person like that. A person who had more integrity than almost anyone she'd ever met, and who had spent 2 decades fixing cars on Alderman Street and called it sufficient. You couldn't make it right. You couldn't give back the version of his life that had been taken. You couldn't turn 19 years into something other than what they were. What you could do was know the truth of it, know it fully, without the softening of incomplete information. know who he was and what he'd done and what it had cost, and still be there on this bench with the too-strong coffee on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not a resolution in any dramatic sense, but was something more durable than that. She reached into her bag and took out the printout. She set it on the bench between them. He looked at it, read the header, read his name. She watched him read it. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he picked it up, folded it once, carefully, along the natural crease, and put it in the inside pocket of the canvas jacket. "Thank you," he said. "You earned it 22 years ago," she said. "I know." He looked out at the street. "It's still good to have it." They sat a while longer. The afternoon light moved in its slow way across the pavement, and she thought about nothing complicated, which was its own kind of luxury. At some point, a car she recognized, a regular customer's, a 2012 Subaru with a check engine light that had been coming and going for a year, turned onto the street and pulled up in front of the shop, and her father set down his coffee and stood up. "I'll get the soup started after this," he said. "Take your time," she said. He went to meet the customer. She sat on the bench with her coffee and watched him. Watched the way he listened to the customer explain the problem, nodding once, already moving toward the car to look under the hood, already thinking through what it might be, already at work. She thought about the nameplate that was somewhere in his desk at home, the one from his office at Ether Dynamics, kept in a drawer for 19 years alongside a recording and a documented truth. She didn't know if he'd ever take it out again, or if it would stay in that drawer now, its work finally done. It didn't matter. The name was back where it belonged, in the public record, on the document in his jacket pocket. The rest was just an object in a drawer, and some things are allowed to stay exactly where they are. She finished her coffee. She watched her father work. And on Alderman Street, in the ordinary afternoon of a day that looked like every other day from the outside, she felt something settle in her that had been slightly misaligned for a long time. The specific piece of knowing, finally and completely, who you came